This video was brought to you by our backers on Patreon like Tay. If you sign up now, you can get an exclusive TLDR lanyard absolutely free. Find out more at the end of this video. When you think of two-party systems, you probably think of America. That's because since the 1860s, every single president of the United States has either been from the Republican or Democratic Party, with one or other party controlling the Senate and the House for that entire time period too. So with dominance stretching back for decades, I think it's fair to say that these two parties dominate the US political landscape. But what if this wasn't the case? What if there were other major parties who were competitive with the big two, a more European model? Well, in this video, we explore that idea and take a look at the findings of a recent study which suggests 3 new parties the US could do with. Before we start, let's just get this out there. There are other parties. The Democrats and Republicans might hog all of the attention, but there are other political parties out there. In the 2020 presidential election, the Democrats got 81.3 million votes, and the Republicans 74.2 million, representing 51.3% and 46.9% of the vote respectively. This leaves about 2% unclaimed though. Well, 1.9 million of those votes went to the Libertarian Party, and about 400,000 to the Greens, America's third and fourth largest parties. So yes, America does have other parties, including a bunch of others we haven't even mentioned. But no, it's not comparable to countries like the Netherlands, where voting is always split. Essentially, all voters in the US are choosing between just 2 parties. So is this just because the US is more polarised than other countries? Does the US really just love these 2 parties and strongly hold left and right-wing views? Well, a study conducted by Echelon Insights tried to unpack that by asking voters where they stand on a bunch of different policies. These questions place voters on an axis from left to right economically and culturally. Now, I cannot say this clearly enough. This isn't the political compass test. Sure, it's political, and sure, it's compass-looking, but it's a completely different study, which is good, because as I explained in a recent video, linked below, the political compass is pretty garbage. Anyway, how did people score in this analysis? Well, first let's look at the traditional political extremes, those who fell either very left on both axes or very right. The study found that 13% of respondents fell into this very left-wing bucket, while 16% fell in the very right-wing side. Those are some pretty significant numbers, but it does suggest that the US isn't hyper-partisan and divided. America certainly is divided and polarised, but there are clearly a bunch of people outside of these extremes. So let's look at these same sections, but shift closer to the centre. People who are still wholly left or right, but less strong in their sentiment. 26% fall on this softer left, and 26% also fell on the softer right. The study specifically notes that people don't fit neatly into either box, with most people holding a mix of conservative and liberal values on economic and cultural issues. In fact, they remark that about 20% of respondents don't fit into either of these major buckets, even the softer sections. So where do these people go? Well, 14% fell into the economically liberal but culturally conservative quadrant, people who are happy with higher taxes and a larger government while wanting to protect their traditional values. While 6% were placed in the culturally liberal but economically conservative section. Something which may be surprising, considering how much you hear this section discussed online. So it does seem that people tend to fall in these 2 quadrants, broadly represented by the Democrats and Republicans. But it's not all that clear-cut, with some definite disagreement and space for additional parties. And that's because, as I mentioned earlier, most people don't exclusively have left or right-wing views. For example, when it comes to economic issues, a small majority of Americans support a smaller government offering fewer services, while a majority say that it's the role of the federal government to ensure that everyone has healthcare, and even more say that taxes should be raised on those earning over $200,000. On cultural issues, a majority support the liberal view of abortion and gun control, while taking the conservative position on immigration, nationalism, and policing. So people aren't neatly fitting into one party or another, leaving room for other groups to represent the electorate. Before we discuss these hypothetical parties, when looking at this data, I wondered where these voters currently go in the absence of new hypothetical parties. They have to vote for someone, so which party do they lean towards? Well, according to the data from Echelon, those in the top left quadrant tended to shift right and vote Republican, with 75% voting that way, while those in the bottom right tend to vote more Democratic, suggesting that ultimately these cultural pools make a bigger difference than economics, at least in 2021. These shifts are interesting too, because when you group the sides together, you find that the economic liberals beat out the economic conservatives, while social conservatism has greater support than cultural liberalism. So why is there no one in this segment? Because while the Democrats and Republicans broadly try to represent these groups, and I say broadly because I really don't have time to get into an argument with you about the exact placements of them on this grid, but there clearly isn't anyone for these people. During the Trump era, the GOP seemingly attempted to attract more of these people by not focusing on many standard economically conservative ideals like deficit reduction, and instead attacking companies, especially big tech, and focusing on social issues, potentially forcing a divide between these two sides of the GOP. So, if the current parties are sort of failing to represent people's views, then who are these other potential new parties that we mentioned, and where do they fit onto this grid? Well, helpfully, the Echelon study actually proposes the new parties: the Nationalists, the Conservatives, Acela, Labour, and the Greens. You'll notice that they didn't just add 3 more parties, they adapted the current ones too, so each party is able to focus on a more specific voter base, more like the European model. The study also describes each party, explaining what their core policies and platforms would be. So the Nationalist Party would focus on stopping illegal immigration, putting America first, standing up to political correctness, and ending unfair international trade deals. Unsurprisingly then, the paper suggested Trump as this party's hypothetical leader. Next, the Conservatives stand for defending the American system of free enterprise, promoting traditional family values and ensuring a strong military, with their proposed leader being Mike Pence, a more traditional small c conservative figure. Next, we have the so-called Acela Party, who would work to advance social progress, including women's rights and LGBT rights, working with other countries through free trade and diplomacy, cut the deficit, and reform capitalism with sensible regulation, with their proposed leader being former US Mayor and Democratic presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg. The next party is the Labour Party, whose focus will be putting the middle class first, passing universal health insurance, strengthening labour unions, and raising taxes on the wealthy in order to support programmes for the less well-off, with their suggested leader being current President Biden. Finally then, we have the Greens, who'd pass a Green New Deal to build a carbon-free economy with jobs for all, break up big corporations, end systemic inequality, and promote social and economic justice, whose hypothetical leader is Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. These parties aren't necessarily the only options, and there are other parties you could suggest, but they do map quite nicely onto the parties which already exist in European multi-party democracies. For example, in the UK we have the Conservatives and Labour, although R1 has a U, as let's be honest it should do. We also have the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the Reform Party, formerly the Brexit Party. The same is true in the Netherlands, a country I mentioned earlier, which is famed for its parties and coalitions, where the parties align a bit like this. And if the proposed US parties were implemented in the Netherlands, we could expect their parliament to currently look a little like this, with Acela as their largest party. But how would Americans vote if these were their options? Would people on this compass shift to vote for the parties that most closely align with their needs? Well, it's a tough question, as there's always tactical voting which comes into play in multi-party democracies. But the study did ask people who they'd vote for. When they asked, they stripped away all of the party names, proposed leaders, and even colours, just asking them which of the parties they'd be most likely to support based on policy descriptions. According to their research, the Labour Party would come out on top, with their 2021 survey giving the party 26% of the vote, the same as the previous year. Snapping at their heels would be the Nationalist Party, who, up 8% from 2020, would scoop 24% of the vote in 2021. Next up, and where the nationalist support has been stolen from, is the Conservatives, down to 19% of the vote in 2021. Then you'd have the two slightly smaller parties, Acela and the Greens, with 10 and 9% respectively, both down slightly from 2020. Obviously, once personality, charisma, branding, the media and all the rest come into play, then these results would change. After all, people around the world regularly vote against their self-interest and ideology, but this is broadly how you can expect the results to split down. Now, if the US were to implement such a system, the parties wouldn't be the only new thing. The country would also have to become accustomed to coalitions, because if this is how votes split across all federal levels, then you'd likely see groupings emerge, with Labour senators likely relying on Green and Acela support for bills to get passed. This might feel a little weird if you're from the US, a country very accustomed to single-party governance. But we actually made a video on how Europe makes coalitions work over on the TLDR EU channel, so you can check that out if you're interested. It's linked down below. Now, coalitions aren't always a good thing, but having more parties would help people find representatives who better align with their idiosyncratic views, signalling the policies that people are interested in, and the flavour of liberalism or conservatism which most interests them. However, with coalitions forcing compromise anyway, it's unclear how much difference this would actually make when you're just talking about combining together again anyway. So I'd be interested to hear what you think of this proposal. Comment below which party you think you'd vote for, as well as whether you think a multi-party system would actually improve US democracy or just make things worse. As I said at the start of this video, we're running a Patreon promotion at the moment, whereby Patreon backers paying more than $5 a month can get an absolutely free, never for sale lanyard. To claim yours, just sign up to the TLDR Patreon and click the link below. Signing up not only snags you a lanyard, but also gets you other perks too, like early access to videos, exclusive live events, merch discounts, and more. Find out what you can get and sign up by clicking the link in the description. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video.